The sun had barely crested the horizon, spilling a muted gold across the dry, windswept plains when Clara's journey began. Her small bundle of belongings felt impossibly heavy, pressing against her chest like the weight of her own shame. She had spent the last few weeks in a haze of dread and resentment, trapped in a house that had once been her home but now felt like a prison. Her family had decided her fate with cold pragmatism, seeing her not as a woman who had loved and lost, not as a human being whose grief deserved respect, but as a burden to be relocated, a problem to be sent away to the remote ranch of Jed. The cowboy whose reputation preceded him. Clara walked slowly, each step kicking up clouds of dust that clung stubbornly to her worn boots. The prairie stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of muted greens and browns swaying in the wind. The horizon was a pale line where the sky met the earth, and for Clara, it felt like an expanse of uncertainty stretching ahead. She was unprepared for this kind of isolation. Her previous life had been constrained by the social structures of town and family. But out here, she was confronted with the vast, untamed world and the knowledge that she would have to survive within it. The journey was a test of endurance, both physical and emotional. Clara had been given a horse for travel, a gaunt, tired animal that seemed to mirror her own weariness. Riding it brought her little comfort. She could feel the wind biting at her face and the relentless heat of the day soaking through her clothes. Each hour she passed alone across the plains, the weight of her family's rejection pressed more heavily on her heart. She wondered how they could be so cruel, how they could take the only remaining family she had herself, and cast her aside as if she were a piece of unwanted furniture. Her grief for her late husband, once private and consuming, became a silent companion in the saddle, riding beside her with a quiet, steady ache when she finally glimpsed the ranch in the distance. A cluster of simple structures surrounded by a few scattered trees, she hesitated. The cabin, made of rough-hewn logs, seemed almost pitifully small against the vastness of the prairie. Smoke spiraled from a single chimney, blending with the dry air, carrying the scent of wood smoke, livestock, and the faint tongue of sweat. The land around it was untamed, wild in its natural state, and the sight of cattle grazing in the distance reminded her of the harsh, unforgiving life that awaited her here. Jed, the cowboy, was there to greet her. Though greet might be too generous a word. He was standing near a broken fence, hammer in hand, his sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned, muscular arms streaked with dirt and scars. His face was angular and weathered, the skin etched with lines of hardship and survival. He was a man of few words, known to townsfolk as a stoic figure who spent his life in solitude, tending to the cattle and the land with meticulous care. When he saw Clara approaching, he paused, taking her in with a long, assessing gaze that made her chest tighten. There was no smile, no overt welcome, only the quiet, intimidating presence of a man who lived entirely on his own terms. Clara dismounted clumsily, her hands trembling as she handed the reins to the cowboy. She lowered her eyes, feeling the sting of humiliation, and wondered what life here would demand of her. Her family's cruelty had intended this assignment as a form of punishment, a way to humble her, but in her heart she resisted that submission. She had lived through loss before. She could endure hardship again. Yet there was no denying the fear creeping into her chest. Yet's presence, his unyielding gaze, made her feel small and exposed. Like a fragile bird landed in a cage of iron, Jed studied her silently, noting the nervous way she held herself, the slight tremor in her hands, and the careful way she avoided meeting his eyes directly. At first glance, he saw only a vulnerable widow sent as a burden, but there was something in the way she carried herself, something quiet, dignified, and restrained that intrigued him. Despite her fear, she did not collapse under the weight of the situation. She did not plead or beg. She simply stood there, a mix of apprehension and defiance coiled together, a contradiction that piqued Yet's curiosity. Inside the cabin, Clara's first impressions were of stark simplicity. The space was small, sparsely furnished, and utilitarian. A rough table sat against the wall, 2 chairs pushed neatly beneath it, and a fireplace with embers glowing faintly provided the only source of warmth. The walls, lined with shelves holding a few essential tools and a handful of books, spoke of a life of careful efficiency. There was no ornamentation, no unnecessary luxury. Every object served a purpose, much like the man who owned the place. Clara felt the tension of the space immediately. It was not hostile, but it was unwelcoming in a way that made her keenly aware that she was entering someone else's world. A world where she would have to prove her worth simply by existing within it. The first meal they shared sparse bread, salted meat, and weak coffee was quiet and awkward. Neither spoke much. Jed watched her with a careful, almost predatory attention, as if he were measuring her in his mind, assessing whether she would disrupt the delicate rhythm of his life or fall into it. Clara, for her part, struggled to read him. There were no overt gestures of kindness, no warmth to soften the edges of this encounter. Yet, in the silence, she detected a subtle observation, a recognition that she was not entirely invisible to him. The complexity of his character fascinated her even as it intimidated her. That night, Clara lay in the small cot provided for her, the thin blanket barely offering comfort against the chill of the prairie night. She thought of her family, of the injustice that had sent her here. And yet, amid the fear and resentment, there was a quiet spark of possibility. The land around the cabin, harsh and beautiful in its rawness, reflected the life she was entering, one where survival required strength, resilience, and courage. And in the silent figure of the cowboy who had become her reluctant host, she sensed that there was more to discover than she had first imagined. Jed, too, remained awake, staring into the flickering embers of his fireplace. He reflected on the arrival of this widow who had been thrust into his life by forces beyond their control. At first he had felt irritation and mild annoyance. He had lived alone for so long, grown accustomed to the rhythm of solitude, and the intrusion of another person threatened to disrupt the careful balance he maintained. Yet beneath that irritation was a growing curiosity. There was something in Clara's demeanor, the subtle strength beneath her fear, that hinted she would not simply fold under adversity. Perhaps, he thought, this punishment imposed by her family could become an unforeseen opportunity for both of them. As the night deepened, the wind whistling through cracks in the cabin walls, both Clara and Jed faced the first true test of coexistence. They were two strangers thrown together by circumstance, shaped by very different experiences of life and loss. Clara's family had intended punishment, yet it was in this harsh, untamed environment, in the quiet tension of a cabin at the edge of the prairie, that the possibility of transformation began to take root. The narrative of the widow as a burden and the cowboy as a stoic recluse was only the surface. Beneath it lay the seeds of mutual respect, unspoken understanding, and a bond that neither could yet comprehend. In this opening outline, the story's emotional landscape is established with care. Clara's vulnerability and quiet strength are highlighted alongside Jet's rugged independence and latent sensitivity. The frontier itself becomes a character, a harsh, unyielding force that shapes both individuals, testing them, and forcing them to confront themselves in ways they never have before. By the end of this first chapter, the reader understands the gravity of Clara's displacement, the depth of her grief, and the potential for an extraordinary relationship to emerge from circumstances that began as punishment, the tension between fear and curiosity, isolation and human connection, punishment and opportunity, sets the stage for the unfolding story. Clara's journey is not only physical but deeply emotional, navigating the treacherous terrain of rejection, loneliness, and the subtle complexities of trust. Jet's journey is equally internal, revealing a man whose strength is not merely physical but emotional, waiting for the right catalyst to awaken the warmth and compassion he has kept dormant for so long. Their fates are intertwined from the very first encounter, and though neither fully understands it yet, the story promises a transformation that will redefine both their lives. The days following Clara's arrival were a delicate balance of routine and tension. The frontier demanded hard work, and the ranch offered no reprieve from the physical labor required to maintain its vast expanse. Clara quickly realized that survival here was about more than enduring the loneliness or the initial humiliation imposed by her family's cruel punishment. It was about proving in small but consistent ways that she could exist in this harsh environment without being a burden, yet his attention to her was subtle, almost imperceptible. He did not offer assistance unnecessarily, did not praise her efforts, and did not extend kindness that might soften the edges of their relationship. This indifference was deliberate, part of the way Jed maintained control over his own life. He had seen too many people falter when life required resilience, too many seek comfort when it was not afforded. And yet, despite this hardness, he was observant. He noted how Clara struggled with simple tasks, like hauling water from the well or feeding the chickens. But he also noticed how she persisted, how her hands blistered but did not falter, how her body moved with cautious efficiency, and how her gaze, though wary, never entirely avoided him. Clara, for her part, grappled with a mixture of fear, resentment, and a growing sense of curiosity. At first she had bristled at Yet's stoicism, interpreting it as coldness or even disdain. Each command he issued, whether to tend the livestock, repair a fence, or fetch supplies, felt like an assertion of dominance meant to remind her of her place. But slowly, she began to perceive the structure behind his strictness. He was not cruel. He was precise. The tasks he assigned were necessary, the routines deliberate, designed to maintain the ranch and perhaps in some quiet way, to teach her that life in this wilderness was unforgiving, yet fair if met with determination. Their interactions were awkward, tinged with unspoken tension. Clara often found herself observing Jed, studying the rhythm of his day, the way he handled cattle with a combination of patience and authority, the way his eyes softened when he watched the land wake under the morning sun. Jed, meanwhile, observed Clara's resilience, her willingness to learn, and the subtle hints of intelligence and intuition that guided her actions. There were moments when he almost smiled at her stubbornness, when he caught her attempting to lift a stubborn sack of feed and found her struggling but refusing help. Those were the moments that made him pause, just enough to consider that this woman might be more than the burden her family claimed. Trust, however, did not come easily. Clara had been betrayed before by life, by her husband's death, and now by her family. To trust Jed would mean letting down barriers that had kept her safe in a world where vulnerability often led to exploitation. Each glance, each conversation was a careful negotiation. Jed did not offer handholds for her to lean on emotionally. He expected her to find her own balance. And yet, through shared labor and silent observation, small cracks appeared in their emotional walls. She noticed the way he reacted to misfortune on the rancho, horse wounded, a fence collapsed, a sudden storm approaching, and realized that his detachment was not indifference but a deep, quiet engagement with the responsibilities he carried. One morning, the turning point came when a sudden storm swept across the prairie. Wind whipped the tall grass, sending dust and debris into the cabin, and rain pelted the roof with relentless force. A small barn where some of the animals were housed had a door loose on its hinges. Jed moved quickly to secure it, but Clara, instinctively, followed. At first, Jed was reluctant, sensing the danger, but she persisted, helping to hold the door and secure the latches. They worked in near silence, the storm raging around them, the only sounds their coordinated effort and the fury of nature. After the storm passed, a quiet camaraderie lingered in the air. Jed allowed a rare nod of approval, subtle but significant, and Clara realized that her efforts had earned a measure of respect. This was trust beginning to form, not through words but through action, through shared experience in the crucible of a harsh and unyielding environment. It was fragile and tentative, but it existed, a fragile bridge across the divide that had first separated them. Throughout these early weeks, Clara's emotional transformation unfolded. She began to see the ranch not as a prison but as a space of potential. Each task she mastered, each animal she cared for, and each day she survived became proof of her capability. The land, once intimidating, began to feel like a place where she could exert control, a realm where her actions had immediate consequences and her resilience could flourish. She discovered strength she had not known she possessed, and in doing so she began to shed some of the fear and shame her family had imposed upon her. Jed, too, experienced a subtle transformation. Clara's presence reminded him that life could be more than routine and survival. Her persistence, intelligence, and quiet dignity stirred a long-dormant recognition of companionship. He had lived in solitude for so long that he had forgotten how much the human heart craves connection, how even the smallest gestures of trust could reshape a life. Her willingness to engage with the land, to learn its rhythms, and to endure its hardships signaled to him that she might belong here not just in the cabin, but in his life, yet the struggle for trust was ongoing. Misunderstandings flared. Clara misinterpreted his silences as disapproval, and Jed misread her hesitations as weakness. Each misstep required patience, both from her and him. There were nights when she cried quietly in her cot, frustrated by the labor or by the weight of her displacement. Jed would hear her sobs through the thin walls and choose whether to intervene or remain silent, a tension that tested the limits of empathy and restraint. Sometimes he left small signs of care: a warm blanket by the fire, a clean cup of water, or a word of practical advice without acknowledging that these were gestures of concern. In these subtle ways, their relationship deepened, a quiet negotiation of boundaries, respect, and understanding. By the end of this outline, the foundation of mutual respect had been laid. Trust was not fully formed, but it was emerging through the shared experience of hardship, labor, and subtle emotional connection. Clara was no longer merely a widow sent as punishment. She was an active participant in the life of the ranch, shaping the land and her own destiny within it. Jed was no longer solely a stoic cowboy. He was a man learning to recognize the strength, resilience, and value of another human being, even when that recognition challenged the solitude he had cultivated for so long. The stage was set for deeper emotional bonds. But this outline emphasizes that trust is earned through consistent effort, courage, and the willingness to face both danger and vulnerability together. It is not given lightly. It is hard-won in the crucible of shared experience. This struggle forms the emotional backbone of the story, highlighting the growth of both characters and setting the trajectory for the next phases of their journey: cooperation, respect, affection, and ultimately, love. In essence, the frontier itself mirrors the emotional journey. Just as Clara learns to navigate its treacherous terrain, she must also navigate the complexities of human emotion and connection. Jed, shaped by years of isolation and hardship, must confront the walls he has built around his heart and recognize the value of companionship and mutual reliance. Their paths, initially defined by punishment and distance, begin to converge through effort, observation, and the subtle but powerful emergence of trust. The passage of weeks and months on the frontier brought subtle but profound changes to both Clara and Jed. Life on the ranch was relentless. A daily rhythm of labor, vigilance, and small victories over the land and its unpredictable elements. Yet within the harsh routines, a new rhythm began to emerge between them, a rhythm of companionship, mutual respect, and the quiet beginnings of emotional intimacy. At first, the bond was forged entirely through action. Clara had adapted to the physical demands of ranch life, learning to herd cattle, mend fences, and manage the unpredictable moods of animals. Each task completed successfully became a small triumph, a proof of her resilience and adaptability. Jed noticed these victories quietly, nodding in approval or offering concise words of advice rather than praise. It was a language of trust and respect rather than sentimentality. He began to rely on her in subtle ways, delegating small responsibilities that required judgment, knowing she would follow through with diligence. This reliance, though practical, was a seed for emotional connection. It demonstrated to Clara that she was no longer simply a burden, no longer an outsider to the rhythms of the ranch. Clara, in turn, began to see Jed not merely as a stoic guardian but as a man shaped by the land, by hardship, and by experiences that had honed his character into a finely tuned balance of strength and subtle sensitivity. She noticed the moments when he softened, how his eyes lingered on the horizon during sunset, how he moved with unexpected tenderness when handling a frightened foal, how he spoke quietly to a wounded animal in tones of gentle reassurance. These glimpses revealed a man capable of depth, whose apparent stoicism masked a capacity for empathy and care. Clara's respect for him deepened. And with respect came the first threads of trust that were not tied to labor alone, but to the recognition of shared humanity. Their conversations remained sparse, deliberate, and often practical, yet they carried new meaning. During long rides across the prairie, they began to speak of memories, of small joys and losses, and even of dreams that had been postponed or abandoned. Jed recounted fragments of his past childhood on the edge of civilization, losses that had left scars deeper than any physical wound, and moments of fleeting happiness that had taught him the value of solitude but also the hunger for connection. Clara shared stories of her late husband, of love and grief interwoven, of the family who had cast her aside, and of her own hopes for a future defined by independence rather than submission. Each story exchanged was a bridge across the emotional divide that had existed between them, allowing vulnerability to enter the space they shared without fear of judgment. The first real test of their emerging bond came during a spring thunderstorm that swept across the prairie with violent suddenness. Rain hammered the cabin and wind tore at the fences. The cattle, sensing danger, stampeded toward the corral, threatening to escape into the open plains. Jed moved with practiced urgency, directing Clara to help secure gates and calm the animals. It was no longer a task he feared to share with her. He trusted her judgment and strength. Together, they worked in tandem, moving with precision, anticipating each other's actions without verbal commands. The storm raged around them, but within that chaos, a quiet partnership had formed, a deep reliance on one another that was both practical and profoundly emotional. By the time the storm passed, a sense of accomplishment and relief hung in the air, heavy and sweet. Jed, uncharacteristically, allowed a faint smile to cross his face, a small but significant acknowledgement of Clara's importance to the life of the ranch. Clara, in turn, felt a warmth that went beyond the satisfaction of completing the tasks. It was the recognition that she had become part of something larger than herself, that her efforts were valued, that her presence mattered. In that moment, punishment had been transformed into purpose, and the loneliness she had carried for so long began to dissipate, replaced by the beginnings of belonging. As their bond deepened, so too did their understanding of each other's vulnerabilities. Jed learned to recognize the signs of Clara's fatigue, both physical and emotional, and began to offer small gestures of care: a warm cup of coffee left by the stove, a blanket tucked around her shoulders during cold nights, or the rare comment acknowledging her skill in managing the ranch. These gestures were understated, never overtly sentimental, but they carried weight precisely because they were given thoughtfully and without expectation. Clara, in turn, learned to read yet silence his movements, and the subtle shifts in expression that revealed more than words ever could. She realized that his apparent detachment was not cruelty but caution, and that his trust and affection, though rarely spoken, were genuine and enduring. The rhythm of their days became a tapestry of shared experiences: morning rides across the prairie, tending to the livestock, repairing fences, and long evenings by the fire where conversation flowed freely enough to reveal glimpses of character and heart. Humor began to emerge in small doses, a shared joke over a stubborn cow, a teasing comment about her inability to lift a particularly heavy sack of feed, or his rare laughter at her determination to prove herself. These moments were precious, lightening the weight of hardship and reinforcing the bond that had grown from mutual respect and shared struggle. Yet the frontier was never forgiving, and external challenges continued to test their relationship. Raiders or rival ranchers occasionally threatened the land. Harsh weather tested the limits of their endurance, and the isolation of the prairie amplified any misunderstanding or miscommunication between them. Each obstacle became an opportunity for them to demonstrate not only competence but trust in one another. Clara learned to anticipate Yet's decisions during crises, moving with him almost instinctively. Jed, in turn, began to rely on her judgment, recognizing that her insights often complemented his own experience in ways that strengthened both their effectiveness and their partnership emotionally. This period of the story explores the subtle evolution from cautious respect to genuine companionship. The intimacy they share is not defined by romantic gestures or overt declarations of love. Rather, it is built on consistency, reliability, and the recognition of the other's intrinsic value. Clara's family intended her placement at the ranch as punishment, yet in this harsh, untamed environment she finds a life defined by agency, skill, and connection. Jed, who had defined his life by solitude and self-reliance, discovers that vulnerability and trust are not weaknesses but pathways to a deeper, richer existence. By the end of this outline, their bond is unmistakable. They have moved beyond the initial barriers of fear, resentment, and indifference. Trust has become tangible, practical, and emotional. They anticipate each other's needs, share in labor and triumph, and protect one another from both the physical dangers of the frontier and the emotional perils of loneliness. The stage is set for deeper developments, the emergence of affection that goes beyond respect, the recognition of the heart's desire for companionship, and the challenges that will force them to confront their feelings in more explicit ways. The landscape itself mirrors the evolution of their relationship. The harsh plains and unpredictable weather serve as both adversary and teacher, shaping their resilience, endurance, and capacity for connection. Just as they have learned to navigate the physical dangers of the land, they are learning to navigate the terrain of human emotion, complex, unpredictable, and often rewarding in unexpected ways. The frontier, once a symbol of isolation and punishment, now becomes a space of transformation, growth, and the tentative emergence of love. The prairie had long seemed vast and indifferent, yet even its beauty held danger. Clara and Jed had found a rhythm together, their mutual respect and trust quietly solidifying into a bond neither had fully acknowledged. But the frontier, as always, had a way of testing even the strongest connections. What began as subtle tensions in their lives, rumors of land disputes, the unpredictability of weather, and the isolation of the prairie soon escalated into a confrontation that would test both their courage and the depth of their reliance on one another. It began with the arrival of a stranger in the valley, a rival rancher from the next settlement over, a man known for his ruthless tactics and greed. Rumors had reached Jed that this man had attempted to expand his territory by intimidating smaller ranches, seizing cattle, and asserting dominance over weaker neighbors. When the stranger's men approached the edge of the property, a sense of foreboding hung over the ranch. Jed, familiar with the harsh realities of frontier life, prepared for confrontation, but Clara's role in the ordeal was uncertain. She was not accustomed to dealing with threats beyond the practical management of the ranch and the land. Yet her presence would prove critical not just in action, but in moral courage. The initial confrontation was tense. The rival rancher rode up with a small band of men, demanding Jed relinquish part of his grazing land and surrender a portion of his cattle. Jed's response was calm but firm. He would not be intimidated, nor would he yield what he had built through years of labor. Clara watched from a distance, heart pounding, unsure whether to intervene or remain in the safety of the cabin. But as the conversation escalated and the rival men grew aggressive, she felt a surge of protective instinct for the land, for Jed, and for the home she had begun to consider her own when the threat turned physical. With one of the rival men attempting to corral a valuable horse toward the outsider's camp, Clara acted instinctively. She grabbed a lasso, recalling the lessons Jed had taught her, and swung it with a precision she did not fully know she possessed. The rope caught the horse, halting its movement and preventing its theft. Jed's eyes widened slightly in surprise, recognizing not only her skill but the courage it had taken to act decisively in a dangerous moment. This act was more than a display of proficiency. It was a demonstration of agency and bravery that had quietly developed over weeks of hard work and shared experience. The confrontation ended without bloodshed, but the emotional impact on both of them was profound. Clara realized that her strength mattered, that her actions could influence outcomes beyond the domestic and practical. Jed, meanwhile, recognized the full extent of her resilience and her capacity to rise to challenges alongside him, rather than merely following orders or performing tasks under supervision. The bond that had been growing through shared labor and quiet companionship now faced an external crucible, forcing them to confront not only the practical dangers of the frontier but the emotional truths of reliance. courage, and recognition, yet the conflict was not only external. Emotional tensions surfaced in ways neither Clara nor Jed had anticipated. Clara, accustomed to the betrayal and neglect of her family, found herself grappling with feelings she had not allowed herself before: admiration, gratitude, and the stirrings of affection for Jed. These feelings were complicated by fear of vulnerability. She had been hurt before, and the frontier, despite its beauty, was unforgiving to those who let their guard down. Jed, too, struggled internally. He had spent years cultivating solitude as a shield, and the realization that he valued Clara's presence more than he had anticipated forced him to confront feelings he had long suppressed. The conflict with the rival rancher became a mirror for their own emotional challenges. Courage and trust were required not just for survival in the physical world, but in the domain of the heart. The following days were marked by introspection and subtle shifts in behavior. Clara became more confident in asserting herself, speaking her mind in practical decisions regarding the ranch, and taking initiative in ways that previously would have seemed impossible. Her growth was not without struggle. There were moments of doubt, small mistakes, and the occasional lapse in courage, but each was met with patience from Jed, who was learning to temper his stoicism with guidance and encouragement rather than command. In turn, Jed became more aware of the depth of his reliance on her, not merely as a worker on the ranch, but as a partner in the shared life they were building. A key moment of tension occurred when Clara proposed a plan to expand the barn. Anticipating future threats and preparing for potential natural disasters, Jed initially resisted, uncomfortable with the change and skeptical of her experience. Their disagreement was tense, highlighting differences in perspective, approach, and understanding. Yet, rather than allowing this to fracture their bond, the conflict became a catalyst for dialogue, negotiation, and compromise. Clara presented her reasoning with clarity and insight, showing Jed that her vision was grounded in practical foresight, not impulsive ambition. Jed, recognizing her competence and the merit of her plan, conceded and agreed to the expansion. In this resolution, trust and respect deepened further, demonstrating that challenges, when navigated together, could strengthen rather than weaken their connection. Another external test arose in the form of nature's unpredictability. A sudden spring flood threatened the low-lying areas of the ranch, forcing both Clara and Jed to act decisively to protect livestock and property. Their previous training and shared labor paid off. They moved together with coordination, each anticipating the other's actions, their trust in one another translating into efficiency and effectiveness. The flood became a crucible not only for practical skill but for emotional reliance. Each action was an affirmation of their interdependence, a testament to the growing bond forged through months of shared hardship and cooperation. By the conclusion of this outline, the narrative demonstrates that both external and internal challenges have pushed Clara and Jed to confront the realities of their partnership. They have faced threats to their physical safety, challenges to their autonomy, and the difficult terrain of human emotion. Through these trials, they have emerged stronger, their bond no longer tentative but resilient and rooted in trust, respect, and mutual recognition. The story's themes deepen in this outline. Courage, agency, and vulnerability are explored not only through individual action but through the dynamic between two people learning to rely on and protect one another. Clara has transformed from a widow sent as punishment to a decisive, competent woman whose strength and intellect shape the ranch's operations and influence Yet's decisions. Jed, in turn, evolves from a solitary cowboy into a man capable of recognizing and valuing another person's contributions, whose emotional walls begin to soften in response to her steadfastness and bravery. In essence, Outline 4 depicts the necessary conflict and test that precedes deeper emotional intimacy. It underscores that love, trust, and companionship are not born of ease, but of shared struggle, mutual respect, and the courage to confront both external threats and internal vulnerabilities. By the end of this section, Clara and Jed are positioned on the threshold of a deeper bond, prepared for the next stage of the narrative, the recognition of love and the full acknowledgement of what they mean to each other. The prairie had changed since Clara's arrival. What had once felt vast, empty, and intimidating now seemed like a canvas upon which life, labor, and love had been quietly painted. Seasons had turned, bringing harsh winters and blazing summers. Yet through it all, Clara and Jed had forged a rhythm together, a partnership built on trust, resilience, and the shared triumphs of survival. The woman who had been sent to the ranch as a punishment had grown into someone integral to its operation, a presence whose courage, wisdom, and empathy could not be ignored. And Jed, whose solitude had been his shield, had begun to understand the depth of his attachment to her, realizing that the arrival of this burden had become the defining blessing of his life. The story's emotional climax begins with a simple moment that carries profound weight. The first time Jed fully acknowledges what Clara means to him, not through deeds alone, but through words. It occurs one evening as the sun dips below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant streaks of orange and purple. They are sitting outside the cabin, the faint hum of cicadas in the distance, the prairie stretched endlessly before them. Clara has been tending to the horses, brushing down their coats, and Jed has been repairing a section of fence damaged in the spring storm. For a long while, neither speaks. The silence is comfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding of shared labor and mutual respect. But then Jed leans back on his elbows, eyes scanning the horizon before finally resting on Clara. There is a gravity in his gaze, a softness that had been absent during the months of their cautious partnership. "You've changed this place," he says quietly, his voice low but steady. "Not just the land, not just the ranch, but me." Clara looks up, startled. She has grown accustomed to Yet's rare words, reading meaning in subtle gestures and fleeting expressions, but these words strike her with an immediacy that she has never experienced before. Her heart quickens, a mixture of disbelief and burgeoning hope. She had never expected gratitude, much less acknowledgement of her emotional significance in his life. Her first instinct is to downplay it, to brush it off as a comment on her labor rather than her presence. But Yet's eyes do not waver. He waits, giving her the space to understand, to absorb the weight of what he is saying. The transformation in their relationship is now visible, palpable in the details of their daily life. They move together in a harmony born not just of necessity, but of desire and understanding. When she hands him tools, when he directs her in the field, there is an unspoken rhythm, each anticipating the other's needs, gestures, and intentions. The ranch itself, once a symbol of solitude and hardship, becomes a metaphor for their emotional journey. The rough-hewn logs of the cabin symbolize resilience. The fences they maintain together symbolize trust. The open prairie reflects the freedom and possibility they have created side by side. Their bond, however, is not without its final challenges. Even as they recognize their reliance and care for each other, there are moments of doubt, fear, and lingering insecurity. Clara worries that the love she feels will not be reciprocated fully, that the walls Jed has built around his heart will prove insurmountable. Jed wrestles with vulnerability, the fear that expressing affection openly will shatter the delicate balance of solitude he has relied upon for years. These moments are crucial, for they underscore the authenticity of the emotional resolution. Love here is not instantaneous or naive. It is forged in adversity, tested by circumstance, and chosen deliberately by two people who have grown to understand and value one another fully. The turning point arrives with a shared challenge that draws upon all they have learned together. A wildfire ignites on the edge of the prairie, threatening both their livestock and the cabin. The crisis demands immediate action, directing the animals to safety, building fire breaks, and coordinating efforts to contain the blaze. Clara and Jed move with a seamless unity, their trust and reliance fully actualized. She directs the movements of the horses and cattle, her voice steady, precise, and commanding. Jed reinforces the fire breaks, following her guidance where appropriate and protecting her when necessary. Together, they confront the danger head-on, their bond now tangible in every motion, glance, and decision. When the fire is finally contained, the relief is overwhelming. They stand together, soot-smudged, exhausted but alive. In that moment, the realization crystallizes. They are not merely companions, they are partners in every sense. Clara's initial journey as a punished widow has culminated in a profound discovery. She is valued, admired, and loved for her courage, wisdom, and heart. Jed, once defined by solitude and self-reliance, has discovered that love does not diminish strength but enriches it. That opening his heart to another human being brings a fulfillment no amount of isolation could provide. The emotional resolution continues with a tender acknowledgement of what has grown between them. Jed, usually restrained in every aspect of his life, takes Clara's hand, a small, deliberate gesture, but one weighted with meaning. He speaks plainly, without pretense or metaphor, words that have been long restrained by fear and habit. "You're my greatest treasure. Clara, you've changed everything, and I can't imagine this life without you." Clara, overwhelmed by the honesty and intensity of his words, responds not with a formal declaration, but with the understanding that has developed over months of shared struggle. She leans into him, their foreheads touching, a silent affirmation that the bond they have built is real, enduring, and irrevocable. The narrative then shifts to the long-term transformation of their lives. The ranch, once a symbol of isolation and punishment, has become a sanctuary and a testament to resilience, partnership, and love. Clara's presence is not merely tolerated. It is celebrated. She contributes not only to the physical upkeep of the ranch, but to the life and heart of their home. Her ingenuity in managing the livestock, tending the land, and navigating social dynamics with neighboring ranchers complements Yet's experience and strength. Together they create a life that is sustainable, harmonious, and deeply fulfilling. Their relationship also carries social and emotional ramifications. Word spreads through the nearby settlements about the widow who arrived as a punishment and the cowboy who discovered her true worth. Neighbors who once viewed Clara as a passive figure or a victim come to respect her intelligence, courage, and leadership. Jed, whose reputation as a solitary and stoic man had long preceded him, now becomes known as a partner in a thriving household, a man capable of both strength and tenderness. The transformation is complete, not only for themselves but in the eyes of the community. The punishment imposed by family has inadvertently created a legacy of respect, love, and triumph. The story concludes with a reflective moment that encapsulates the journey. Clara stands on the porch of the cabin at dusk, looking out over the prairie, the wind tousling her hair. Jed joins her, and for a long time they simply watch the horizon together. A silence filled not with distance but with understanding, trust, and deep affection. The hardships, the punishments, the storms, and the fires, they have all contributed to this moment of fulfillment. What began as a cruel act of familial retribution has transformed into the greatest treasure each had ever received, a partner who sees, values, and loves them fully. Ultimately, this outline demonstrates that the most profound connections often arise from circumstances that initially seem cruel or unfair. Clara's journey from widow sent as punishment to trusted partner and beloved companion is a testament to resilience, courage, and the transformative power of trust and love. Yet's evolution from solitary cowboy to a man capable of deep emotional connection underscores the theme that the human heart, though guarded and tested, is capable of remarkable growth when nurtured by mutual respect, shared hardship, and the courage to embrace vulnerability. By the end of the narrative, the audience witnesses a complete arc. The punishment intended by Clara's family becomes the crucible in which both Clara and Jed are tested, shaped, and ultimately rewarded. The cowboy gains a partner, the widow gains purpose, and together they discover that the greatest treasure in life is not land, cattle, or survival. It is the love, trust, and partnership that emerge from facing adversity together.